Hello dear students, welcome to my class on atomic spectra or atomic spectrum. As you all observed in the last class, we have discussed about the photoelectric effect. Now in this session from structure of atom class 11 PUC or intermediate, we are going to discuss about very important concept, I can say, atomic spectrum or the spectrum formed by different kinds of gases, metals, atoms, molecules, etc. in the vapor state. And when it comes to atomic spectra, first of all, we should know what is exactly the spectra. We can simply call it as it is an image only. It is nothing but an image when radiant energy is passed through prism or grating, that is said to be splitting into different lines, and the lines will be observed in the form of image. We'll see that image using a device called spectrometer or spectrograph, and this we will call it as spectrum. Now coming to another point, what is exactly this splitting? The splitting is nothing but separation of this a single light is a source like white light, like sun, coming from sun, or any incandescent bulb. Okay, then that is splitting into several lines, 7 colors, different colors. That we will call it as dispersion of light into 7 colors, which is known as spectrum. Very simply. And coming to the another point here, if this is said to be a continuous spectrum you want to explain, then one color is said to be merging into another color like rainbow formation. That is known as continuous spectrum. So if this spectrum said to be continuous spectrum, when we will call this is continuous spectrum means that device is said to be giving you one observation like one light, sunlight, where one color merges into another one without any kind of gap between the lines. Such we will call it as spectrum, we will call it as continuous spectrum. But whereas this all information continuous spectrum is simply belonging to light emitted from an incandescent solid set of substances we can consider. Whereas in case of atoms, we have another different kind of spectrum we will see, that we will come to know as discontinuous spectrum. As we all know, this energy is not going to released continuously according to this Max Planck quantum theory. That's why the spectrum, if you observe, having a distinct lines, well defined lines here, the well defined lines with some dark gaps are observed, then that spectrum we will call it as discontinuous spectrum. So what is discontinuous spectrum? Having distinct lines and well defined lines with a gap means dark spaces, dark areas are present in between the lines. That spectrum will call it as discontinuous spectrum. Moving on to the another word, in this spectrum, how we will classify that spectrum into two types. One is called as absorption spectrum, another one is called as emission spectrum. In this, emission spectrum is one of the important spectra, I can say, that it has again further classification into two types, line spectrum and band spectrum. Whereas in the absorption spectrum, the spectrum obtained which is actually from the de-excitation, from the excitation of this what we call the electrons in a substance. This is excitation of electrons from a substance. This emission spectrum is going to be observed when the de-excitation of electrons taken place in a substance. That means what is excitation, de-excitation? Simply say, once the electrons started moving from their place to another place, higher levels, that we will call it as excitation. if higher level of this whatever this electron stage is there, they are coming back to the ground state, their original state. That phenomena is called as de-excitation. In this excitation and de-excitation of the electrons in a substance, releasing energy or absorbing energy in the form of electromagnetic radiation, that energy is said to be causing the reason behind the emission and absorption spectrum. Whereas in emission spectrum, we can see the lines, bright color lines, bright lines on dark background. In absorption spectrum, we will see the dark lines on the white background. That is the difference between emission spectrum and absorption spectrum. And what about this emission spectrum? Also, we can call is a discontinuous spectrum. Emission spectrum is a discontinuous spectrum, and this absorption spectrum maybe is a discontinuous one in most of the cases. So, what is discontinuous? Means the spectrum is discontinuous, means continuously the lines are going to be generated. Whereas any of the gaps are obtaining between the lines, that we will call it as a discontinuous spectrum. And come to one more point, what is the characteristic property of an atom and its spectrum is nothing but some atoms are there in our science. They may be metals in vapor state, or some of the inert gases are there. They have a tendency of forming line spectrum. So line spectrum, what is the line spectrum is characteristic property of atoms. That means atomic spectrum we can call it as line spectrum. Whereas one more type of name of the spectrum is there, that we will call it as band spectrum, in which most of the molecules are said to be forming this band spectrum. Molecules, they are in vapor state. Okay, hot metals and these molecules and whatever the molecules in gaseous state are there, they are said to be forming this band spectrum. Okay, so that's what the meaning of line spectrum and band spectrum. We have a question in the examination. That question can be asked in two types. Difference between the spectrums. One is the difference between line spectrum and band spectrum. And another question is the line spectrum and band spectrum, one question. Emission spectrum and absorption spectrum, one question. Two different questions they may ask in the examination from this concept of atomic spectrum. Okay, thank you. In the next small discussion video, we have hydrogen emission spectrum discussion we will do. So we will discuss about hydrogen emission spectrum in the next video. Until have a nice day. Thank you.